Ep 1. The day the shadow vanished. They say every man has a shadow, but I remember the day mine stayed behind. The morning was silent in St. Aurelius, a village where the church bell rang, even for sins too small to confess. I stood at the altar, my hands trembling around the crucifix, the weight of every whispered sin from my flock pressing down on me. I was Father Elijah, a servant of God, but that night, I was something else. It began in the confessional. An old woman came first, trembling, her words dripping with fear. "Father, I dreamed my shadow strangled me." I laughed it off, gave her a blessing, but then a man came, then a child, each with the same confession. Their shadows moved without them. I stayed long after midnight, alone in that chapel. Candles bled waxed down the walls like tears. And then, I opened the book. Not scripture, no. This one was bound in leather too old to have a name, hidden beneath the altar for decades. Its pages were prayers that should never have been spoken. If your sins cannot be carried by flesh, it read, bury the part of you that sins. I remember the sound, a whisper, soft at first, like the wind through broken glass. It came from beneath my feet. I stepped outside under the pale moon, my breath sharp in the cold. There, behind the church, I dug. My hands tore through the dirt until my nails bled, and when the pit was ready, I knelt, pressing my trembling fingers against the ground. "Take it," I whispered, and something did. The earth shifted, hungry. My shadow peeled from my feet like smoke and slid into the hole, writhing as if alive. It didn't fight me. It obeyed. When I stood again, I cast no darkness at all. For the first time in years, I felt clean, holy, weightless. The next morning, the villagers gathered outside the chapel. They stared at me, their eyes wide, lips trembling. "Father," one of them whispered, pointing at the ground. "Where is it?" I looked. The sun was high, and they were right. I had no shadow, but I only smiled. "God," I said, my voice calm and certain, "has finally forgiven me." They didn't notice the earth behind the chapel. They didn't hear it breathe. That night, as the candles in my room burned low, I heard it again, a whisper, from the grave where I buried it. "Father Elijah," it sighed, "I'm not done with you." And for the first time, I realized, you can bury a shadow, but you can't keep it in the ground forever. Ep 2. The grave beneath the chapel. They warned me not to go back there, but I am a priest, and priests do not fear the dark, or so I told myself, as I knelt on the cold stone floor of the chapel, staring at the altar. Beneath it lay the hole where I buried my shadow, covered only by a thin layer of soil and silence. Except tonight, it wasn't silent. At 3:33 a.m., the candles flickered without wind. The wooden beams groaned as if the church itself could feel it. I leaned closer, pressing my ear to the floor, and that's when I heard it. Prayers, not mine, not human. A chorus of broken voices, whispering the words of the Mass backward, syllables sharp as knives. In Omen, Retro, Domini. I should have run. I should have called for the bishop. Instead, I smiled, because for the first time, I believed I was hearing proof of the divine. I tore the boards from the floor, fingers raw and bleeding, until I uncovered the dirt. The sound was louder now, like 100 tons scraping against stone. And then, with a trembling hand, I reached into the earth. The soil was warm. Something brushed my fingertips. It felt like skin. I jerked my hand back, heart hammering, but the whispering didn't stop. No, it grew clearer. A single voice rose from the grave, deep and hollow, and it spoke my name, Elijah. I staggered backward, clutching my crucifix. "Who speaks? You buried me," it rasped, "and yet I still follow." I wanted to pray, but the words choked in my throat. My shadow, me sin, was not dead. It was alive, and it was learning to speak. The chapel doors creaked open. I spun around. No one was there, but the candles bent toward the grave, as if drawn to it, and then I saw it. A hand, black as ink, clawing through the dirt. It didn't reach for me. No, it pressed itself flat against the ground, like it was blessing it, and then it began to pray. The air turned heavy. The crucifix above the altar cracked. I stumbled back, breath ragged. "God help me," I whispered, and from beneath the floor, my shadow laughed. God is already here, and he's standing in the dark with me. The laughter didn't stop until dawn. By then, I wasn't sure if I'd bury my shadow, or if I'd buried the last piece of my soul. Ep 3. The first confession. It was just past dusk when she came to me, Maria Delgado, a baker's daughter, her hands trembling as if she carried a sin too heavy for flesh. I led her into the confessional. The sin of wax and incense thick in the air. I slid open the wooden grate. "Speak, child," I said softly. For a moment, she didn't breathe. Then, in a voice raw and shaking, she whispered, "Father, my shadow doesn't follow me anymore." The words crawled under my skin. I leaned closer, my fingers tightening on the lattice. "What do you mean?" She swallowed hard. "I was walking home last night. The moon was bright. But Father, there was nothing, no shadow. And then, I heard it, behind me, breathing." My chest tightened. I wanted to tell her she was imagining things, but I remembered the grave beneath the chapel, the whisper that called my name, the black impressing against the soil. "Go on," I said. Her voice broke. "I think it's following me, but it's not mine anymore." I closed my eyes. I should have sent her away. I should have told her to pray and leave, but instead, I lifted my hand, tracing the sign of the cross in the darkness. "I can take it from you," I murmured. Silence. Then, in a voice almost too small to hear, "Please." I don't remember the prayer I spoke next. It wasn't in the Roman rite. It wasn't in any rite. The words spilled from my tongue like black water, and as I spoke, I saw either shadow sliding across the confessional wall, twisting, peeling away from her feet. Maria gasped. The shadow tore itself free like skin ripped from flesh, and then it was gone. When I opened my eyes, she was sobbing, trembling, clutching my hands through the grate. "Is it over?" she asked. I forced a smile. "Yes, child, you're clean." But I didn't tell her about the sound, the faint scrape of nails coming from under the chapel floor, the sound of another shadow being dragged into the pit. That night, I watched Maria walk home in the pale moonlight. She didn't have a shadow anymore. She looked lighter. But when I returned to the chapel, I heard it, dozens of voices now, not one, all whispering from the earth beneath me. And somewhere in that chorus, my shadow's voice rose above the rest, one by one. "Father, bring them to me. And God help me. I think I will." Ep 4. Blood in the holy water. I used to love the sound of water filling the font. A simple lactally water, pure and untouched. It reminded me of the day I first became a priest. But now, even water fears me. It began at dawn. I stood alone at the altar, preparing for the morning mass. The village was quiet. Even the bell seemed reluctant to ring. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the silver cruet, the clear water shimmering in the light. I whispered the blessing, "In nomen Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti." The words fell wrong in my mouth. I dipped my fingers into the font. The water curdled. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then I saw it. The liquid thickened, red blooming like ink dropped into clear glass. Blood, dark, heavy, and warm, rising to meet my touch as if it had been waiting for me. I stumbled back, the crucifix in my grip's liquid sweat. No, but the font didn't stop. The blood kept rising until it overflowed, spilling onto the altar, crawling down the stone steps like it had a mind of its own. And then voices. They came from the blood, low, chanting, familiar. "Elijah." I turned. The chapel was empty, but their whispers slithered along the walls, climbing the rafters, pressing against my skull. My knees nearly buckled. "Get thee behind me," I rasped, clutching the crucifix. "In the name of..." The blood laughed. I swear on every holy word I've ever spoken it laughed. And then I saw it, my reflection in the font. Not me. Not entirely. My face was there, but darker, stretched, grinning with teeth that were my own. My shadow's face. I reached for it. "God forgive me." I reached, and as my hand neared the surface, the reflection whispered, "Drink, Father. You buried me, but you cannot bury thirst." I ripped my hand back, stumbling until my back hit the altar. And then, as quickly as it came, it ended. The blood vanished. The font was clear again. The church was silent, but I knew better, because when I looked down at my hands, my fingers were stained red, and no amount of scrubbing would wash it away. That night, I didn't dare sleep. because in the silence, I heard it, the sound of water dripping, not from the font, from the grave beneath the chapel, and every drop hit the earth like a heartbeat. Act 5. The Choir of Shadows. Midnight, the hour when the chapel should be silent, when even the dead sleep in peace. But not tonight. I awoke to the sound of music. It wasn't from the organ, its keys were locked, its pipes cold. No, this was older, or voices, a choir, rising from beneath the chapel floor, singing in a language no tongue should know. I lit a single candle and descended the nave, every step an echo swallowed by the sound. The walls trembled with the weight of it, low, mournful notes weaving into sharp, inhuman crescendos. When I reached the altar, I frowned. See, the shadows were there. Not mine, not Maria's, not even the ones I had buried. Down scenes of them, they lined the pews like parishioners, tall and bent, their heads bowed in reverence. They had no faces, only gaping hollows where eyes should be. Yet their mouths, God help me, their mouths were wide open, singing. I clutched my crucifix. In the name of the Father. The candle in my hand went out. The singing stopped, and then, as if every head turned toward me. I couldn't move. Their mouths did not close. Their song had no breath. And then one stepped forward. It was small, thin, a child's shadow. It stopped at my feet, lifted its head, and in a voice that rattled my bones, it spoke. You buried us in silence. Father, now we sing for you. I wanted to scream. Instead, I whispered, what do you want? The child tilted its hollow face, opened the ground, and listened. The floor beneath the altar groaned. The boards cracked, dust spilling like ash. The choir began again, louder this time, pleading, commanding, praising something that was not God. And I almost obeyed. I knelt, my hands trembling over the altar floor, ready to rip it open. But then I saw it, my shadow. It was no longer buried. It stood at the back of the church, grinning, his black hands conducting the choir, like a master of some infernal liturgy. I ran. I slammed the chapel doors behind me and didn't look back. But the singing followed me into the night. And even now, as I write this, I can hear the congregation of shadows practicing their hymn for the day I finally joined them. Act 6. The bells that rang without hands. The first bell rang just after midnight. No wind, no hands on the rope, yet the sound shook the entire village, like a scream torn from the throat of heaven. I leapt from my bed in the rectory, heart pounding, and stared at the chapel tower through my window. The bell swung on its own, and then it rang again. 3 tolls, slow, measured, like a funeral. By the third, I already knew what it meant. I grabbed a lantern and hurried to the church. The air was sharp with the scent of earth, the kind that clings to graves. The doors creaked as I pushed them open, the wooden floor groaning in protest. Inside, that chapel was empty. No congregation, no shadows, just silence. Until the 4th toll, I frowned, see, because this one didn't come from the tower. It came from beneath the altar. The ground shifted, the boards bending as though something beneath wanted out. I fell to my knees, pressing my palm to the cold wood, and then I heard it. A voice. Another one. Father. I swallowed hard. No. Another one. Buried deep. I staggered back, clutching the lantern. That was when I noticed many footprints. They led from the altar straight to the back door of the chapel. And there, on the threshold, I found him. Mateo Ruiz. He was kneeling, his hands folded like a penitent. His shadow was gone. His face was peaceful, too peaceful. I lifted him by the shoulders. His skin was cold, and then the bell rang again 5 tolls, deafening this time, echoing off the stained glass windows until they rattled in their frames. Mateo's lips moved. I leaned close. It's beautiful, down there, he whispered, and then his head fell limp. I stared at him, horror clawing up my throat. I didn't bury him. I didn't have to. The ground beneath the altar opened on its own, and when I dragged his body inside, I watched the earth swallow him whole. No grave, no shovel, just soil parting like water, eager to take him. The bells rang 7 more times before dawn. By morning, the villagers gathered at the chapel steps, whispering among themselves, their eyes darting to the tower. Father, one asked, trembling, why do the bells ring for the living? I had no answer. because I knew the truth. The bells weren't warning us anymore. They were celebrating. Act 7. The confessional that breathed. It began with a sigh. I thought it was my imagination would settling, perhaps, but then I heard it again, low and wet, like you're being drawn through unseen lungs. The confessional was empty. I had locked it after the last confession, yet as I approached, the door trembled against its hinges. I pressed my palm to the wood. It was warm, and then it exhaled. A blast of damp, stale air hit my face, carrying with it the smell of earth freshly turned. Like the soil beneath the altar, my crucifix felt heavier than it ever had before. I whispered a prayer. The confessional answered, "Come closer, Father." The voice didn't come from behind the screen. It came from the walls. I should have fled. I should have barred the doors and called for help, but I opened it instead. Inside, the shadows moved. They didn't belong to me. They didn't belong to anyone. They slithered like smoke, crawling across the wood, pooling in the corners like black water. And in the center, the chair of one where penitence knelt was pulsing, breathing. I knelt. God forgive me. I knelt. And then I heard it rasp of wood on wood, as if the booth itself was grinding his teeth. "Confess, Father," he whispered. "You take theirs, but never your own." My throat tightened. I have nothing. The walls slammed shut, trapping me in darkness. And then it left. "You buried your shadow, but not your sins." I felt it. Thin fingers, not human. Thin, splintered, wooden fingers brushing against my back, pressing me forward toward the screen. I gasped, "In the name of the Father." The booth inhaled sharply, cutting me off, and for a moment, I felt it pull at me, like it was trying to drink me in. I tore myself free, stumbling out into the chapel, the doors of the confessional slamming shut behind me. But just before they closed, I heard it, "Come back tomorrow, Father. Bring more sins. We're hungry." Now I lock the confessional every night, and every night, I still hear it breathing. Ep 8. The midnight mass for the dead. The bell didn't ring at midnight, but I woke anyway. Something pulled me from my bed, an unseen hand. A whisper beneath my skin. I dressed in silence, lit a single candle, and stepped into the chapel. The doors opened without my touch. Inside, the pews were full. They weren't alive. The congregation sat there motionless, their heads bowed, their faces pale as wax. I recognized some of them. Mateo Ruiz, Maria Delgado's father, Sister Rosa, all buried, all gone. And yet, they were here, waiting. The air was colder than any winter night. I moved down the aisle, my footsteps muffled by a carpet of shadows clinging to the floor like spilled ink. As I passed, the dead lifted their heads, and they smiled. The altar candles lit themselves. The organ, silent for years, began to play a hymn I had never heard, a dirge that scraped at my soul. My hands shook, but I raised them anyway, like a priest should, in nomen patris. But before I could finish, a voice answered from the back of the chapel. "No, Father, not his name." I turned. My shadow stood there, tall, grinning, and behind it, countless others rose like black smoke, filling every corner of the chapel. "Then whose?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Ours." The congregation of the dead stood in unison, their mouths open with not in prayer, but in hunger, and together, in one voice that could not have come from any human throat, they began to chant. It was not Latin, it was not any language of this earth, but I understood it, and worse, I repeated it. Each word burned like ash in my mouth. With every verse, the walls of the chapel groaned. The crucifix above the altar tilted, and the earth beneath us shuddered like it was alive. When it ended, silence fell. The dead bowed their heads. My shadow smiled wider, and from the ground beneath the altar, a door began to open. I should have run. I should have closed it, but instead, I lowered my candle and stared into the darkness below. Because for the first time in weeks, I wasn't afraid. I was tempted. Act 9. The door beneath the altar. It was not a door made by men. The ground hewn open where the altar once stood. Its wooden board split apart like ribs pried wide. A black void stretched below, swallowing the candlelight, deeper than any crypt. And yet, it called me. I knelt at the edge, fingers trembling on the cold stone. From the darkness rose a sound, not quite a voice, not quite music. It was breathing, slow, patient, as if something enormous was sleeping beneath the chapel. I should have fled. Instead, I descended. The steps weren't carved. They simply were, as though the earth itself had shaped them long before I was born. My candle fought against the dark, its flame shrinking the further I went, until it barely clung to the wick. Then I saw them, shadows. They lined the walls like paintings, hundreds of them, flouncing mid-scream, their hands clawing at unseen barriers. I recognized some of their faces, parishioners, priests, every one of them a soul that should have been at rest. At the bottom, I found the door. It was not wood, not stone. It was flesh, pale and stretched tight, veins pulsing faintly beneath its surface. A massive cross-shaped seam sealed it shut. And then it moved. A single, low whisper seeped from the seam. Father Elijah, you buried me, but you cannot bury yourself. My hand went numb around the candle. I buried you because you were wrong, I said. My voice cracked, weaker than I wanted it to be. The whisper laughed made a sound so low it rattled my bones. Then open me and see if you still believe. I don't remember moving closer, but suddenly my palm was on it. The flesh was warm, almost feverish. The cross-shaped seam twitched, as if straining against something desperate to be free. Behind me, I heard the choir of shadows. Their voices rose from above, from the chapel, from every grave in the village. Open it. I pressed my hand harder. The seam split, just a little. A single drop of blood slid down and hit the floor like a bell tolling in the dark. And from within that seam, something smiled. I stumbled back, gasping, candle shaking wildly in my hand. The door pulsed once, then went still, as if mocking me. I didn't close it. I couldn't, because now I knew it was waiting for me. And God help me, part of me wants to go back. Act 10. When the dead knocked on the chapel doors. The first knock came at 3:33 a.m. 3 slow, deliberate strikes against the old wooden doors of the chapel. I sat up in my bed, heart hammering, knowing no living soul would be out there at such an hour. Still, I lit my lantern and went to the nave. The knocking came again, louder. I gripped the handle, every instinct screaming not to open it. But then I heard it. Father Mateo Ruiz. I buried him myself. I watched the ground take him. Go away, I whispered. The voice outside chuckled. You put us down there, Father. Now we want to pray. The door shook under another series of knocks. Faster this time. Behind me, the chapel candles lit on their own. Their flames stretched unnaturally tall, casting shadows that didn't belong to me. And, one by one, the dead began to call my name. Father Elijah, let us in. We've been waiting. I backed away, but when I reached the altar, I frowned. See, the door beneath it, one of flesh and seams, was pulsing again, as if it could feel them at the threshold. And with every knock, the seam split wider, leaking thin lines of blood that crept across the floor like veins. The knocking stopped. Silence. And, dun, bang, the doors burst open, but no one entered. Instead, they stood there, down scenes of them. Mateo, Sister Rosa, faces pale as moonlight, eyes black as pits. Their shadows were round, twisted, stretched, moving faster than their bodies. Mateo smiled. Mass is about to begin. Father, won't you welcome us? The crucifix above the altar tilted sideways. The bell tower began to ring without hands. And for the first time, I felt it. The dead weren't asking, they were inviting me. I ran. I bolted the doors, pressing my back to the wood, their cold hands thumping from the other side. I prayed until dawn, but it didn't stop, because they don't leave anymore. Every night, they knock, and every night, the door beneath the altar bleeds a little more. Ep 11, the grave that opened by itself. It happened at dawn. The villagers came screaming to the rectory, dragging me out into the cold morning air. Father, one cried, pale as death. You have to see it. We ran to the cemetery, and there it was, grave 23, the grave I buried with my own hands. Mateo Ruiz's grave. The soil had split clean down the middle, like it had been pushed from below. The coffin lay cracked and empty. No body, only a shadow. He clung to the inside of the coffin, like black smoke trapped in glass, writhing and twisting, but never escaping. And when I leaned closer, it grinned, not with a mouth. Shadows had no mouths, but I felt it, a smile deep enough to pierce bone. Then it spoke, almost ready. Father, I stumbled back, clutching my crucifix, my breath turning to mist in the frigid air. The villagers stared at me, waiting for an explanation. But what could I say? That the dead weren't staying dead, that even their shadows had begun to rise. I told them to go home, to lock their doors, to pray, but I didn't leave. I stayed, and I watched as the shadow inside the coffin pressed itself against the wood, as though it could sense me. You hear them knocking, don't you? It whispered. The door beneath the altar is opening. We will all walk through. The ground trembled beneath my feet. I looked toward the chapel. The bell tower began to toll, even though no one had touched it. When I turned back, the coffin was empty. The shadow was gone, but it didn't vanish. It moved. It slid across the ground like spilled ink, slithering between the gravestones. And then it stopped right at my feet. And when I looked down, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't my shadow anymore. It was smiling up at me. Ep 12, the night the shadows walked. It began without a sound. One moment, the village slept. The next, every candle in every window went out. I stood in the chapel, clutching my crucifix, staring at the door beneath the altar. Its seam had split wide now, bleeding in slow, steady streams that trailed across the floor like veins. The air reeked of soil and rot. Then I heard it, not the dead, the shadows. They moved first in the corner, slithering, writhing, stretching against the walls like black silk alive with hunger. One by one, they detached themselves from the places they once belonged, and they began to walk. I ran to the chapel doors and flung them open. The village below was drowned in darkness. No moon, no stars, only figures flat and formless sliding across the streets. They weren't bound to the ground. They climbed walls, crawled along rooftops. Some of them stood upright, wearing the shapes of the dead they once belonged to. And then I saw her, Sister Rosa, or rather, her shadow. It turned its head toward me, as hollow and endless, and whispered without a mouth, "We are free now, Father. You buried us, but he unburied us." The ground beneath the chapel groaned, a sound like the earth itself exhaling. I turned back to the altar. The door was open, not fully but enough. A black wind poured out, dragging the scent of ancient soil and something older than death. From within, I saw shapes moving, countless shapes, writhing in silence, pressing against the edges of that living flesh door. And they were smiling. Behind me, the village bell tolled once, twice, and then footsteps, not flesh and bone, but the sound of weightless things moving closer. The chapel walls shook. Shadows slipped beneath the doorframe, seeping in like smoke. My own shadow peeled away from my feet and walked toward the altar. Without me, I should have fled. Instead, I left, because I understood. This was not an invasion. It was a mass, and I was the priest who had buried his own shadow so that I could lead them. The first shadow knelt, then the second, then 100 more. They were waiting for me to begin, and God help me. I raised my hands and gave them their midnight liturgy. Ep 13, the Mass without light. There was no dawn that night. The village was gone, drowned in a darkness that had no source and no end. The chapel stood like an island in a sea of shadow, and within it, Father Elijah prepared for a Mass not meant for the living. No candles, no hymns, no God, only them. They filled the pews, hundreds of shadows in human form, silent and waiting, their hollow faces turned toward me, devotion carved into emptiness. Some still wore the echoes of the living they once belonged to. Maria's bowed head, Mateo's crooked smile, and yet they were not the dead. They were something older. I approached the altar. The flesh door beneath it was wide open now. It seemed split into a gaping wound that pulsed like a heart. From the abyss below, a wind, rosy cold, wet, and whispering in a language that scraped the inside of my skull. I raised my hands. Dominus vobiscum, I said out of habit. 100 voices answered, not in Latin, but in a sound like rustling graves. And then, the Mass began. I recited words no priest should know, words I had not learned but remembered, as if they had been weighing in my throat for this moment. With every syllable, the shadows bent lower, trembling in reverence. The crucifix above the altar turned upside down. The wood bled where the nails should have been, and then the offering came. From the doorway of the abyss, a figure crawled forth, not a man, not even a corpse. It was a shadow in the shape of a priest. Its face was blank, but I knew it smiled. It carried a chalice. Inside was not wine. It was black, thick as tar, swirling with something that writhed when I looked too closely. I drank, and the world shattered. I saw the truth, the graves that would not stay closed, the chapel that was no longer a house of God, and my own soul, buried long before I ever touched the first shovel. The congregation stood. One by one, they pressed their hands against the altar, their shadows bleeding into the floor, until the chapel was nothing but darkness alive and breathing. And from the pit, a voice spoke in it loud, but deep enough to drown the world. "Now, Father, finish what you began." I raised my hands higher, and in the darkness, every shadow knelt. Act 14. The sermon beneath the earth. There was no turning back. The altar split wider. The flesh door yawning opened like a wound that had been waiting centuries to bleed. I felt its breath, if you could call it that, rising from below, warm and damp, smelling of earth and something older than rot. And then, it called my name. Elijah. I stepped down. The stone steps spiraled into the dark, carved not by hands but by hunger. My lantern flickered and died after the third turn. But I didn't need light anymore. The shadows lit the way. They slithered along the walls, whispering prayers in tones that tasted like ash and bone. At the bottom, I found the congregation. They weren't people, not anymore. Their forms were stitched together. From memory and darkness, hollow faces I recognized, stretched across shapes that moved like smoke in water. They knelt in a circle, heads bowed toward an altar overall, breathing earth, and above it, the crucifix. But it wasn't Christ who hung there. It was me, a perfect silhouette of my body, bound in shadow and nailed to nothing, his face twisted in silent devotion. The congregation turned their heads toward me in unison, 100 eyeless faces, waiting. I raised my hands, and I preached, not of heaven, not of salvation. I spoke the words that burned in my throat, words that tasted like blood and truth. In the beginning, there was no light, only Him, and He has returned. The ground shook, the altar bled, the shadows wailed like a choir dragged from the grave. And then, they began to crawl closer. They didn't walk, they flowed, each one pressing their darkness into me, filling the hollows in my bones, making me heavier and yet impossibly vast. When the last one touched me, the shadow nailed to the crucifix opened its mouth. "Bury yourself, Father, and rise as one of us." I looked up, and for the first time, I saw the thing behind the flesh door. It had no shape, no face, just a darkness so deep it could swallow God Himself. And it was smiling. I stepped closer, and the sermon ended with silence. Because I wasn't preaching anymore. I was descending. At 15, the priest without a shadow. I don't remember when I stopped feeling the weight of my own body. Down in the pit beneath the altar, time dissolved. The flesh door sealed shut above me, and for a moment, I thought I was buried alive. But then, I understood. I was not buried. I was planted. The shadows gathered around me like roots in black soil, coiling into my veins, whispering in unison, "You are one of us now." I should have prayed. I should have begged for mercy. Instead, I smiled. The darkness poured into me until there was no room left for breath, for light, for Elijah. My shadow detached completely, standing before me like a twin. It reached out and pressed its hand against my chest. I vanished into it. When I opened my eyes, I stood in the chapel again, but it was no longer a chapel. The walls bled scripture no man had written. The crucifix was gone, replaced by a gaping hole that pulsed like a throat. And outside, the village was silent because there was no village anymore, only shadows. They moved like a tide, filling every doorway, every window, kneeling in worship not of God, but of me. I stepped forward, and for the first time in my life, I left no shadow behind. I was the absence of it. "Father Elijah," a voice whispered it from one throat, but from all of them at once, "Lead us." I raised my hands, and the bell tolled without wind or hands, echoing through a world that no longer belonged to the living. I began the final liturgy. My voice carried through the darkness like thunder, and the earth itself bowed. From the pit beneath the altar, the thing that smiled rose, a shape without form, draped in eternity, and it knelt before me. "It is finished," I said, And with those words, the last light in the world went out. I was not Father Elijah anymore. I was a priest without a shadow, and my mass had only just begun.
Epilogue: The chapel that breathes in the dark. They say the village was erased from every map. No roads lead there now. No signs remain. But if you walk long enough through the woods, where even the moon refuses to follow, you might find it. The chapel. It should not be standing. Its walls lean like broken ribs. Its bell tower crooked against a starless sky. And yet, it breathes. You hear it before you see it. A low, steady sound. Like lungs drawing air through rotten wood. Some swear the walls pulse when you get close. As if the building itself is alive. And at 3:33 a.m. The bell tolls. No one rings it. No one ever could. But the sound cuts through the dark like a scream that's learned to pray. Those who've dared to step inside say the pews are full. Not of people. Not even of ghosts. Just shadows. Sitting upright. Heads bowed in eternal devotion. At the altar stands a man, or something wearing the shape of one. He has no shadow. They call him the priest who buried his own shadow. Some say if you speak his name, he turns to look at you. Others swear he never moves at all. That his hollow smile is carved into his face like a wound that won't heal. But if you stay too long, if you let the darkness of that place touch you, your shadow begins to move on its own. And when you run, it does not follow. It stays. Kneeling in the pews. Praying. Waiting for the next mass to begin. So if you ever find that chapel where no road should be, don't go inside. Because once you do, the world above will forget you. And the bell will toll for you next.